defeated by delicious fruit pie. I want to go over the mug of the week. It is, of course, I talk to myself. Sometimes I need expert advice, and you'll see why that is a very appropriate mug for this week's episode. Yeah, so there's that. I also want to give a shout out, and I'll talk about this a little bit at the end of the episode too, but we are post 1,000 subscribers, so thank you all. I really appreciate telling friends and getting people on here. You know, we don't really do marketing for this. I did post the thing on Facebook, and that had some people check us out, but I really appreciate that. It's really cool to see that people are enjoying the show, and our downloads are up on our iTunes, so, you know, all that stuff is really cool. I just really wanted to thank everybody for that. I will be doing a 1,000 subscriber episode because, you know, that's so many subscribers. But I will be doing it anyway. I think it'll be fun to do. And if you have any suggestions for that, let me know. I have some ideas, but it'll be a solid edited video. I'm also working on some more of these short clips for the nature videos and things like that. So feel free to throw in some suggestions on that. I'm really excited about some of the ones that I have that I've been working on for this week. It just has to not rain for like a day to do a couple of them. So I'll get that out probably by August at this point. So, all right, so people are here, and I'm going to be doing this as kind of the intro to the video. We already went over the mug. So this week, I just want to make it very clear, and you'll see at the bottom, it says Satire Alert, Fake Conspiracy Theory Video. So just want to make it very clear. This is not really my opinion, okay? There are some things that are maybe questionable that you can look up and you can see, and it's just like, it's wild, and some of the stuff that I'll talk about is, it's kind of crazy, but in no way am I saying this as like a real thing. I am not trying to be a conspiracy theory video channel, and I don't need this little like box underneath all my videos flagging me for putting out false information. So this is all fake news, just FYI. But I wanted to put that out there, and I have it down so that as anybody comes in and they hear me talking about stuff, they're not like, what in the heck is he talking about? So with that in mind, it is going to be time for our campfire conspiracy theory. And for this segment, I'm going to talk about something that, you know, it's always been burning in the back of your mind. And I know that you've been thinking about it, and nobody really ever talked about it. And that is Helen Keller. If you look at her Wikipedia, let me just get started with an introduction to this. I was just thinking randomly about Helen Keller, and like you do, and it came to my attention from her historical documentation and things that she was a prolific writer and a speaker, a public speaker. And that just really didn't strike me as being honest. It's considering that she was mute and deaf and blind, from what I understand in the history, at least that I was looking at, from the time she was 1, when she got severe, I think they called it like nose and stomach and throat congestion or something. It was some weird title for whatever it was. But anyway, so she was like super deaf and super blind. So it was really odd to me that she was a speaker and a writer, and a prolific one at that. I mean, she's written several books and a lot of articles. So then I had to get deeper in. I had to look this up. So that's kind of just the impetus of this whole thing. Now, I want to preface this fake conspiracy theory with a real issue that happened in the mental health world not too long ago. It was probably about 10 years ago. There was a time when there were communication boards that were being given to families with children who had autism or were severely handicapped in the sense that they couldn't talk or communicate with their parents. And so what they had was boards where they could use guided hand-over-hand typing out what the kids wanted to say to the teacher, to the tutor, or to the parents. And some miraculous things were found during the use of hand-over-hand and guided typing. And what was found is that they were getting these amazing write-ups, these amazing paragraphs and emails and books and communique from these kids that seemingly were completely nonverbal, and we would have no way of knowing what they were thinking. And they were saying things like, you know, I feel trapped inside my body, I want to communicate, but I can't, I love my parents so much. And it was like really heartbreaking and heart-wrenching, and it was tough, but it was really cool that like these devices were allowing children to communicate with family members and friends and teachers and things in a way that was unlike anything anybody had ever seen or heard. it was almost too good to be true. You can see where I'm going with this one. It was too good to be true. So unfortunately, when researchers were trying to figure out how this was working, and they were getting these students to actually do these things without their guidance person, without their handler, without their parent, without the tutor, they were kind of getting garbled nonsense. They weren't really getting these eloquent masterpieces that they were getting when their parents were writing. Time and time again, this seemed to happen. And it got to the point where the researchers concluded that this was unintentional manipulation by the parents or the tutor or the teacher onto the child to get them, almost like a Ouija board. Like they were getting them, can you imagine that? Like human Ouija boards. That's awful. That's an awful idea. But they were doing that to get people to kind of make it so that they would hear what they wanted to hear. It was, and this goes back to the fraud of when they brought this school of children and they were asking them like very pointed questions, very leading questions about whether or not they were being, how to say this, assaulted by adults in their community. And like many of them said yes. And what they found out was that many of them said yes because the questions were leading and because the kids wanted to please the people asking them the questions. And so it turned out that this was all a big lie, and it just like disrupted and destroyed this whole community, and there was all these false allegations running around. So I bring up these 2 points to discuss Helen Keller. So I hope this is going to be just like a little bit of an introduction that helps you to start to see things from where I'm seeing them. So let me begin by starting with Helen Keller's Wikipedia. So again, bear with me on this. But Helen Keller, she was born in June 27th of 1880. June baby, rock on. And she lived until June 1st of 1968. So almost a totally round life from June to June. Great way to start and end. It's an awesome month. So happy June, everybody. And so it says right here in the beginning that she was an American author, a political activist, and a lecturer. Did you know that? I really didn't know that. She was the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. The story of Keller and her teacher Anne Sullivan was made famous by Keller's autobiography, meaning she wrote it herself, The Story of My Life, and its adaptations for film and stage. The Miracle Worker, I'm sure you've heard of that one. Her birthplace was in Alabama and is now a museum. Here's why this is like a thing, right? Because the museum sponsors an annual Helen Keller Day. So there are people who are making money off of this story right now. There's curators and employees and a foundation, and they're all making money off this story. So it's very important that this story is accurate. Her birthday on June 27th is commemorated as Helen Keller Day in Pennsylvania. Woo, Pennsylvania. And in the centenary of year of her birth, she was recognized by a presidential proclamation by Jimmy Carter. Good job, Jimmy, Mr. President. So a prolific author, Keller was well-traveled and outspoken in her convictions. A member of the Socialist Party of America and the industrial workers of the world, she campaigned for women's suffrage, labor rights, socialism, anti-militarism, and other similar causes. She was inducted into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame in 1971 and was one of 12 inaugural inductees to the Alabama Writers Hall of Fame in June 8th, 2015. There's a lot here talking about her writing. So I'm going to get into some why this starts to get fishy. So here's where it starts to get fishy. It talks about in the beginning of her life, at 19 months old, she contracted an unknown illness described by doctors as an acute congestion of the stomach and the brain. So it could have been like scarlet fever or meningitis. It left her both blind and deaf. She lived, as she recalled, in her autobiography, at sea in a dense fog. Picture that, if you will. Picture that, if you will. At sea in a dense fog. Now, she lived as a 19-month-old, as she recalled in a book she wrote, something that she tried to help us visualize. I'm really trying not to laugh. Like, I'm really trying. But red flag. Do you remember when you were 19 months old? Neither does anybody else. So superpower number one already we are with Helen Keller. She has the superpower of remembering everything from when she was 19 months old, all the way back then, so when she was 1 year old. Superpower number two, she's using visualization in her language for us to better understand her perspective, when she became blind at 19 months old. Let's continue. So at the time, she was able to communicate somewhat with Martha Washington, the 6-year-old daughter of the family cook who understood her signs. By the age of 7, Keller had more than 60 home signs to communicate with her family and could distinguish people by the vibration of their footsteps. Cool. And that's actually not that odd, right? In 1886, Keller's mother, inspired by an account in Charles Dickens' American Notes, and we'll get back to Mr. Dickens in a little bit, of the successful education of another blind and deaf woman, Laura Bridgman, who we're going to talk a lot about too, dispatched the young Keller, accompanied by her father, to seek out physician J. Julian Chisholm, an eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist in Baltimore. Blah, blah, blah. Basically, who that got everybody connected to is Anne Sullivan, a 20-year-old former student. Anne Sullivan, herself visually impaired, became her instructor. It was the beginning of a 49-year-long relationship, during which Sullivan evolved into Keller's governess and eventually her companion. So she had a handler for 49 years from the time that she began her training until, sadly, Anne had a stroke, I believe, and she died. But that was pretty close. I think it was like within 8 years of when Helen Keller also passed away. So this is the beginning of them communicating. Sullivan arrived at Keller's house on March 5th, 1887, a day Keller would remember as my soul's birthday. Sullivan immediately began to teach Helen to communicate by spelling words into her hand, beginning with D-O-L-L, for the doll that she had brought Keller as a present. Keller was frustrated at first because she did not understand. Okay, so we're getting to the fact that she's being taught hand signals in her hand. Again, cool, whatever, that's a cool thing. So she began to understand those, and Keller's breakthrough in communication came just a month later. So she's very smart. She realized that the motions her teacher was making on the palm of her hand while running cool water over her other hand symbolized the idea of water. This is like that scene in the movie or like the play, I don't know if you saw it, when like that's like the big deal is the water scene. So not to downplay this, because it's actually really cool. Like, that part's really cool. But let's get into the formal education, shall we? In May of 1888, Keller started attending the Perkins Institute for the Blind. The Perkins Institute for the Blind. We'll get back to this, too. This all is involved in this conspiracy theory that is obviously fake, but we're going to go through it anyway. In 1894, Keller and Sullivan moved to New York to attend the Wright-Hampson Humason, that's a weird word, School of the Deaf, to learn from Sarah Fuller. They returned to Massachusetts, and Keller entered the Cambridge School for Young Ladies before gaining admittance in 1900 to Radcliffe College of Harvard University. So she's Cambridge and Harvard educated. She lived in Briggs Hall, shout out. Her admirer, Mark Twain, had introduced her to Standard Oil magnate Henry Huddleston Rogers, who, with his wife Abby, paid for her education. So Harvard and Mark Twain convinced some rich people to pay them money to educate Helen Keller. Feel-good story of the year, right? All right, so she graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Radcliffe, becoming the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. She maintained a correspondence with the Austrian philosopher and pedagogue Wilhelm Jerusalem, who was one of the first to discover her literary talent. Interesting thing about the Austrian philosopher, and we'll get into eugenics and some of Helen Keller's more dark beliefs. Determined to communicate with others as conventionally as possible, Keller learned to speak and spent much of her life giving speeches and lectures. She's deaf, blind, and mute. She spent much of her life giving speeches and lectures on aspects of her life. She learned to hear people's speech by reading their lips with her hands. Her sense of touch had heightened. She began proficient at using Braille. Again, that's cool. Seen that. That's fine. And reading sign language with her hands as well, which obviously we have somebody taught this form of sign language to her. Shortly before World War I, with the assistance of the Zoellner Quartet, she determined that by placing her fingertips on a resonant table, she could experience music played close by, much like Beethoven did when he became deaf. That's kind of cool, too. Examples of her lecture. This is where stuff starts to get weirder. On January 22nd, 1916, Keller and Sullivan traveled to the small town of Menomonee in western Wisconsin to deliver a lecture at the Maybelle Tainter Memorial Building. Details of her talk were provided in the weekly Dunn County News on January 2nd of 1916. Now again, there's no video footage of this. There's no evidence of this. But a newspaper wrote what she said as if she said it. But no, even in this, it says, this message came with the visit of Helen Keller and her teacher, Mrs. John Macy, and both had a hand in imparting the speech Saturday evening to a splendid audience that filled the memorial. Then it uses like quotation marks around, gave a talk with her own lips on happiness, which I love quotation marks, and it will be remembered always as a piece of inspired teaching by those who heard it. I mean, source or it didn't happen, right? Like, so this is like weird. Even the paper's saying, well, the teacher kind of did it with her. Almost like, yeah, they facilitated it, but this is Helen doing a speech. So it's interesting that it's not saying that Helen inspired language and her teachers and people gave, you know, these long lectures and presentations with her and she was there as well. It's saying Helen Keller gave these speeches. That's a really interesting framing for a deaf, blind, mute person to be giving speeches. And that's the way we're going to talk about it. That's so we'll get into that too, because there's actually some video footage of her talking, quotation marks, but it's pretty worrisome how that went down. So when the account was reprinted in January 20th of 2016 edition of the paper, the column compiler added some things too. Helen Keller spoke of the joy that life gave her. So there's like a lot of stuff like that. So let's talk about the players involved. Anne Sullivan stayed as a companion to Helen Keller long after she taught her. Sullivan married John Macy in 1905, and her health started failing around 1914. Polly Thompson was hired to keep house. She was a young woman from Scotland who had no experience with deaf or blind people. She progressed to working as a secretary as well, and eventually became a constant companion to Keller. So as Anne Sullivan started to become less and less capable of handling Helen's speeches and things, we had another person kind of step in. Keller moved to Forest Hill, Queens, together with Sullivan and Macy, so she lived with other people, and they were there with her. She used their house as a base for her efforts on behalf of the American Foundation of the Blind. So again, here's a foundation who does a lot of good, who got a lot of money from a spokesperson like Helen Keller. Just, you know, it's good that that foundation exists, but they're making a lot of money on this, on the behalf of this person. Like, she was able to help raise a lot of funds for this organization. And we'll talk about this conspiracy that digs a little bit deeper with Laura Bridgman. So, while in her 30s, Helen had a love affair, became secretly engaged. How? How is it a secret? How did she know who she was talking to tell the secret to? And what is going, how do you keep secrets? Who was keeping this secret? She's like secretly signing with this dude, and then like Anne's sitting there going, well, you know what's going on tomorrow? And Helen's like, yeah, nothing. Just hanging out with this guy, no big deal. I mean, like, it should have been obvious that they were falling in love. I mean, you would assume all of their interactions would be visible since she lived with a couple of people, and everything that was going on was very visible and outside. There was no, like, whispering or talking, is what I'm saying. There was no whispering. So, she defied her teacher and family by attempting an elopement with the man she loved. He was Peter Fagan, a young Boston Herald reporter who was sent to Helen's home to act as her private secretary when lifelong companion Anne fell ill. So another person who wanted to steal her away when the person that was handling her before was starting to fall ill. So Anne Sullivan died in 1936 after a coma as a result of coronary thrombosis. That's sad. And Keller holding her hand. That's like really sad. And they did love each other, and it's obvious. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about, is that like they clearly cared about her and she cared about them. So we'll get into why that ties into this whole thing. They traveled worldwide and raised funds for the blind. A lot of money. A lot of money was raised with an American hero talking about how she overcame everything and was talking. You get my point. Okay. So political activities. Again, this would all be fine except for that there's some inconsistencies here, and we'll talk about these. Keller went on to become a world-famous speaker and author. We already said that like 8 times. She's remembered as an advocate for people with disabilities. Is she, though? Is she? And we're going to get into that in a little bit. the deaf community was widely impacted by her. She traveled to 25 different countries giving motivational speeches about deaf people's conditions. She was a suffragette, a pacifist, a radical socialist, a birth control supporter. Again, that's interesting. And an opponent of Woodrow Wilson in 1915. So those are all the politics she kind of got involved in. And what's interesting is that she got involved with people like Alexander Graham Bell, Charlie Chaplin, and Mark Twain. Keller and Twain were both considered radicals at the beginning of the 20th century, and as a consequence, their political views have been forgotten or glossed over in the popular mind. I think it's no coincidence that some of her political beliefs were kind of glossed over and forgotten, because they seemingly contradict some of her other beliefs, and for somebody as intelligent as Helen Keller, that is a problem. So we're going to get right into that. Keller was a member of the Socialist Party and actively campaigned and wrote in support of the working class from 1909 to 1921. Many of her speeches and writings were about women's right to vote and the impacts of war. Now remember, this is when she was hanging out with another radical, Mark Twain. So coincidentally, when she meets Mark Twain, hangs out in Cambridge, she starts to write for the Socialist Party, becomes a radical socialist just like her friend. That's really interesting. The next thing that's interesting about her is that she joins the industrial workers of the world, and she is explaining that her motivation for activism came in part of her concern about blindness and other disabilities. That seems very political. That seems like, not political like obviously they're saying she's an activist, but like a politician would say that. And she was around people who were making money and propagandizing her to get support. So that's really interesting too. So the other thing that just kind of the blurb that gets dropped in here, Keller supported eugenics. In 1915, she wrote in favor of refusing life-saving medical procedures to infants with severe mental impairments or physical deformities, stating that their lives were not worthwhile and they would likely become criminals. Keller also expressed concerns about human overpopulation. People with disabilities, she thought, their lives were not worthwhile and would likely become criminals. Does that not seem a little odd? Remember back before when we were talking about one of her first people that she was friendly with, a certain philosopher that she met in college? Isn't it a little weird that she then starts to worry about and pine about overpopulation and eugenics? Those people who were involved in eugenics were in those social circles at the time. It's just odd that she seemingly is advocating for everything that the friends around her were advocating for, and she was doing so in an eloquent and almost politician-like way. Very well-spoken and very specific and visual in the language, even. So, the other thing that's interesting, and again contradictory, is that when Helen Keller was young, Anne Sullivan introduced her to Philip Brooks, who introduced her to Christianity. Keller famously was found saying, "I always knew he was there, but I didn't know his name." Now again, here's quotes, but I don't know what that's a quote from. I mean, how do we know she said that? Because she wrote it in her autobiography that was very eloquent and used a lot of visualization? I don't know, but that's a really odd thing, right? So in her spiritual autobiography, again, another autobiography, for somebody, she writes a lot about herself, was published in 1927 and then in 1994. So she was deeply involved in these churches because she was involved with certain people that believed in things. And here's the things that she believed. It wasn't just like Christianity. She believed in what Emanuel Swedenborg, the Christian revelator and theologian who gave a spiritual interpretation of the teachings of the Bible and who claims that the second coming of Jesus Christ has already taken place. This is not just like, yeah, you know, some pastor was talking to her and now she's like, hey, I'm a Christian. She's like pretty serious with this Emmanuel guy. Adherents use several names to describe themselves, including Second Advent Christians, Swedenborgian, and the New Church. Keller described the core of her beliefs in these words. But in Swedenborg's teaching, it, divine providence, is shown to be the government of God's love and wisdom and the creation of uses. Since his life cannot be less in one being than another, or his love manifested less fully in one thing than another, his providence must needs be universal. I love that phrase, must needs be. He has provided religion of some kind everywhere, and it does not matter to what race or creed anyone belongs if he is faithful to the ideas of right living. Says the advocate for birth control during a time where that was considered heresy and anti-Christian and baby killing. I mean, I'm not going to make a political argument here. All I'm saying is this is the same person who believes that disabled people are worth less and that infants that are unborn are not worthy of life. As long as you believe in this religion, then you understand that creation everywhere has the same value as long as they believe in the ideals of right living. And this writing is very, very good, and it's very spiritual, almost like a pastor would write it. So here, this is all of the things that I wanted to talk about here, is that we talk about Helen Keller and how she was a great writer and a speaker, but I'm really confused. It seems a lot like there are lots of people who are around her that had all these ideas that she then wrote very eloquently about. And it almost looks like the same voice of the speakers that she knew and was hanging out around. That seems very interesting. So why bother? Why am I talking about this? And why would Helen Keller be, not a hoax, but why would her writing and be suspect? And why would her speaking be suspect? If you go, and I'll put this link in the description when we do this, if you're watching this later on and you're not doing it live, there you can actually look up Helen Keller speaking, and on YouTube you can find that there's a very disconcerting video where Anne is trying to describe how they taught Helen how to speak, and it just looks very, very much like ventriloquism. It just really doesn't look like she's giving a speech herself. And there's another video I watched before earlier today where it looks like she's parroting this longer speech that maybe she wrote, maybe she understood the words of, but maybe some other things were kind of coached and she wasn't really using those words. And then when her interpreter, or handler, as I keep saying, was mimicking what she was saying to clarify for people, she was adding in a few words here and there, almost like, hey, she didn't really say all the words, but I know the script, so I'm going to say it. I know what she was going to say before she said it. This is all, again, very disconcerting. So we are being fed this woman saying all of these things and propagandizing us time and time again to be inspired to donate money for political causes, religious causes, activist causes, and organizations. Again, not making a judgment on whether any of those are good or bad, just saying. Kind of seems like we're being sold a bag of goods here. So what's the deal? Why did I say that this was interesting in regards to Laura Bridgman? Well, we're going to get into that, and I'm really glad you didn't ask. So there's a really interesting Slate article on the education of Laura Bridgman. She was Helen Keller before Helen Keller. Then her mentor abandoned their studies. So I'm not going to go through and read this whole article. I really encourage you to, and maybe I'll put the link of that too in the description. Why not? Why not just make this a whole research conspiracy theory article so that you all can drive yourselves insane while you're trying to go to sleep at night? But very few people today seem to know who Laura Bridgman was. But in her day, she was considered the most famous woman in the world other than Queen Victoria. So I want that to sink in. You've never heard of her, but at the time, she was as famous as Queen Victoria. Also tells you when she was alive. She was Helen Keller before Helen Keller. But abandoned by her mentor, she died in obscurity. So there's a lot of reasons why this is telling. Number one, and I'm going to go over the main points of this because again, I don't want to belabor the point. Labor Party. I don't want to belabor the point. But this person, Laura, was born decently before Helen Keller. She was born in 1829 in New Hampshire. She was, by her mother's account, a lively, intelligent, extremely curious child who at 18 months began to talk quite plain and learn a few letters of the alphabet. But then when she was 2, so this is close, not 19 months, but 24 months, she suffered a bout of scarlet fever that left her blind, deaf, and nearly devoid of the senses of taste and smell. So she was very much more disadvantaged than Helen Keller. Within a year, she had forgotten how to speak, although I'm not sure how they figured out that she couldn't taste and smell. Did they ask her? Again, I just curious. Again, I'm not trying to make a judgment here. But Laura repeated the words dark, dark in puzzlement at her inability to see. That is horrifying. P.S. That is just a horrifying situation that would usually drive people insane. I don't know if you've ever done any research on sensory deprivation chambers. Obviously you have, because who hasn't? I have. And it's one of the things that they would do with astronauts and with people that were going to be in like undersea and other situations where claustrophobia might have been an issue, but where sensory deprivation is a big deal. It's like when you go into a cave and you have the lights off and it's quiet, it can literally start to make you crazy. So most people would be driven mad at the idea of not being able to hear or see. And yet here we have this other woman, young girl, 2-year-old girl, who managed to keep her wits. Very impressive. In 1837, so now fast forward to when she was 7 years old, there was a doctor, Dr. Howe, who was a braggart, who was a jerk, who was self-aggrandizing, somebody who really just wanted to be famous and get what they wanted out of, you know, their career. And yet, this is the person that decided to pick up her case. Interestingly, too, this person started and was the administrator for the Perkins Institute for the Blind. Starting to connect some dots. The same place that Helen Keller was sent to, the same person, this Dr. Howe, persuaded the parents of Bridgman to let her go to the asylum in Boston. Boston, where Cambridge and Harvard are. Interesting. This is where this guy was getting the beginning of his foundation started. And he found a beautiful spokesperson for his cause, a cute 7-year-old girl who was blind and deaf. And he decided that he was going to take on this case and get her to understand language. So it sounds like he did. There are a lot of accounts here that say that she did. Then he used to use her and walk around and introduced her to Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens visited the Perkins Institution and was not surprisingly deeply moved by his meeting with Laura Bridgman. Hers was a case that would have fit ideally into one of his own novels. And in fact, when he wrote a little bit about a story similar to that, Helen Keller's family kind of stumbled upon that, and that inspired them to have her get help. Isn't this really odd? I mean, it's just like a really weird coincidence that this story just piles right on to the next story. She became a celebrity. As Laura's celebrity grew, the number of visitors to Perkins increased. Interesting, almost like they got more attention once they started to parade her around. July 6th, 1844. Picture it. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's in black and white. Picture it in your head in black and white. Maybe sepia. I don't know. 1,100 people gathered to see Laura writing letters, reading books of raised type, threading fine needles with her tongue. I'm not sure why that's a thing. And spelling sentences into her teacher's hand. They clamored for her autograph, pieces of her knitting and needlework, samples of her writing, and bits of her hair. That's gross. In America, all over, girls began poking their dolls' eyes out, tying green ribbons across them, and renaming them Laura. This was a famous girl, and you've never heard of her. I mean, maybe some of you had, but like, you're nerds. Like, you might be doing research or something like this. Who are you? So she became what the public wanted, an idealized, sentimentalized symbol of suffering tempered by goodness and hard work. So this is like the whole setup, right? She was America's darling. She was doing all the things. But she had no idea of the extent of the world's interest in her, obviously. And her private daily life was exposed to the public. Bottom line is, things started to get interesting. She was found to be pinching people, stealing food from the kids in the institute that she was in, being aggressive, almost like she was being frustrated that she wasn't communicating with people or they weren't understanding her. So at the same time that she's being touted as this great communicator and this person who's overcome her language difficulties, even though she's blind or deaf, she was having the same type of tantrum behavior that I have seen many times over with simply students who are unable to speak, let alone deaf and blind. That's really interesting. That's a little weird. So there were some other issues, but mainly the big letdown was when this Dr. Howe disappears for 18 months for some holiday. He got married and then he disappears for like a year and a half, because that's a thing apparently for very rich doctors in Boston. So he comes back and he finds out that this experiment he was going to run, and by run meaning he wanted it to happen but he wasn't planning on doing it at all himself, did not work out. He wanted to make her tabula rasa on the whole religion thing to see if maybe she'd be fine without it or not come to religion herself, because at the time, everybody just talked about religion, so it'd be really interesting to see if somebody was not religious. And so then she goes on to learn. Oh, hold on, I got a comment on this. Not mute. She said she learned to speak. Yeah, please go and watch the video on her speaking. It's It's not just cringy, it's borderline offensive. I don't really know that that's speaking, and if it is, I don't know if she understands it. So again, I'm just, go look at that. She is mute. She was deaf, dumb, and blind. That's like how she was diagnosed. So I'm not the one who said that. That's like what her doctor said. But anyway, going back to Laura. So Laura was taught all about Christianity anyway when this guy was not around. So he comes back and turns out that she's like spouting off all this evangelical stuff. Again, interestingly, simply repeating the things that the person that was next to her was teaching her. That was Christianity at the time. And he gets very mad and decides, you know what? You're done. Not helping you out. Calls her defective, says she has all kinds of problems, ditches her in public life, and then about 16 years or so after he started the Institute saying that blind and deaf people were the same as everybody else, he totally reverses and goes 180 on that and says they're not like everybody else and they're mentally disabled because of their the impact of being blind and deaf. Basically saying, hey, look, after I've done all this work for like 16 plus years, what I can tell you is that I was wrong and there really are significant limitations to intellect because you're unable to understand things as easily with this lack of ability, with the lack of sensation. So again, that's really troubling that he was saying that about her, ditches her. Now, what's her fate? How does this end up? How does this go? She, after all of this, she gets basically abandoned and she disappears into the institute that she was in. And then she is just playing around doing needlework and sadly dies in obscurity. Nobody really talks to her. She had a mother who really didn't care about her because she had 4 other kids to worry about and they were able and she was a farmer. So she kind of needed them to be helping her out and couldn't really spend time on her own daughter. So her only mentor ditches her. Her mother kind of just isn't there for her. But here's the really interesting part at the end. Toward the end of her life, Annie Sullivan, a certain Anne Sullivan, stated that she had always believed Laura Bridgman to be intellectually superior to Helen Keller. Huh? So she knew her and then went over to work with Helen Keller. That's the bridge. From this fraudulent foundation that was using a girl, a 7-year-old girl, to propagandize and make them money, after ditching her, goes immediately over to Helen Keller and starts propagandizing people to continue to fund the research and the institute that they were already using a blind and deaf girl for. It's the same formula. It's just they swapped out celebrities when the other one started, showing signs that they really weren't being understood. Helen Keller herself said that if Bridgman had Anne Sullivan, as a teacher, she would have outshone me. Did Helen Keller say that? Did Helen Keller say that if only this poor girl Laura had Annie Sullivan under her wing, she would have been better than me? Yeah, it seems very aggrandizing to Annie. What's the point of even saying that except for to tout how good Anne Sullivan is? I mean, we already kind of know, right? We don't need this. But this is really interesting that's the bridge between these two things. Now, I looked up some information on Helen Keller being able to speak, and what I found was that the page that they had that was like, oh, here's the link to the resource that shows that, she can speak, that link was not found. It was a broken link, and it was on a site that had like cat videos and some other nonsense on there. It was very, very credible. So then I go into some more research, and I'm looking at like where the information is for the sources on this Wikipedia. And one of the very interesting things that I found was that the archival material of Helen Keller stored in New York was lost when the Twin Towers were destroyed in the September 11th attacks. The Helen Keller archives are owned by the American Foundation for the Blind. So you can't verify most of the things that went on with Helen Keller because of 9/11. I'm not making this up. That's actually accurate. Seriously, that part's not a joke. The Twin Towers being destroyed on September 11th is why you can't verify a lot of the stuff on Helen Keller. Ba-dum-ba-da. So let's recap. Basically what we have is one story of a girl named Laura who had nobody that liked her, and people who were blatantly using her to further their career and advance their institute. And because of that, they were bad people, and they really didn't have her best interest in mind, and so she fell away into obscurity as soon as they could drop her and find a better celebrity. because obviously they knew about Helen Keller and then dropped this girl. Then the second story we have is of another girl who has the similar affliction, and yet because she's surrounded by people who genuinely love her and care about her and want her to succeed, she magically is able to graduate from Harvard and able to get a bachelor's degree in Phi Beta Kappa and move on to writing multiple novels with her novelist friends, multiple articles for her political activist friends, speak to the sermons of her pastor friend, and then fight for the movements and causes that her friend group also wanted her to fall into. She was a spokesperson. She was a model citizen, an American hero. What's the difference here? In the one case, it just was what it was. If Laura was actually as capable as Helen Keller and knew how to communicate as well as Helen did, I think it would have stood to reason that she would have been able to grab the attention of a couple of other people and had new handlers, and she would have been able to have a successful career as well. But that's not what happened. She kind of was driven insane and just started playing with needlework and quietly obsessed over her own stuff for the rest of her life until she died. Whereas Helen Keller, seemingly with some hand-over-hand assistance, was able to communicate beautifully and write in ways that inspired people and said all of the things that the people who loved her would want her to be able to say to them. How much she loved them, how much she admired them, how much she appreciated the work they did. And it all comes back to the assisted hand-over-hand boards that the autistic population in the early 2000s were involved in, and yet the scandal still showed that as much as these people were not knowingly the culprits in this scandal, they were in fact manipulating the writing of the people that they were trying to help. So I'm not saying that Helen Keller can't read, I'm not saying she can't write, and I'm not saying she doesn't understand Braille. All I'm asking is a question. Was Helen Keller capable of writing and using literary terms and able to speak in ways that would instill visualizations and auditory ideas into people that she was trying to communicate with? Ancient alien theorists say yes. But as we know, ancient alien theory is also a conspiracy theory. So whose conspiracy theory is better? Mine or the story on Wikipedia? You decide. That's it for the conspiracy theory portion of this. I'm really interested in what you have to say and what your thoughts are on this. I'd love your comments. I love doing these sorts of things. I love going in depth on nonsense and ridiculous things and just really like going into the depth of that and talking about it. So please feel free to comment below if you're watching this afterward. As always, feel free to email me, defeatedbydeliciousfruitpies@gmail.com. You can also find us on DBDFP on iTunes. You can also find us at DBDFP on Twitter. We're also Defeated by Delicious Fruit Pies on Facebook. Again, go on Facebook and Twitter and like it and follow it so that you will know when we're doing our weekly episodes. This week I had to do it at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I'm trying to get down to a 7 p.m. It just hasn't seemed to have been able to happen in the last few weeks, but I am trying for a 7 p.m. slot because I know for a lot of people it's pretty late. But I am going to be doing that. So let's transition into a little bit of Best of the Rest. I have some even deeper and more meaningful and heavier things to talk about. Number one, I got a new SNES game. It's Final Fight 2. This is in amazing condition. It has the booklet still, and it's in its box, and it has all of the things. It's in perfect shape. And I have it for my new Super Nintendo that I just got recently. I'm very excited about the people that I got it from, and I'm hoping to do an interview with them soon and kind of just talk about them and where they are. Because you can order from them online, I don't feel bad advertising what they do on this, and I hope that you guys can check out their website later on. But that'll be more forthcoming in the next few weeks. Hopefully we will connect and we'll do an interview. The second thing that I want to talk about as the Best of the Rest is this guy. Demolition Man. Wesley Snipes and Sylvester Stallone, a future dystopia that has joy feelings and high fives from far away. This movie is something that's really just a feel-good movie for everyone involved. It has Dennis Leary and Sandra Bullock in it, and it really just captures the spirit of America in Los Angeles. It's exactly like, looks like Los Angeles today, and it really captures Taco Bell and how good of a restaurant it is. And you'll see that in the movie. I'm very excited to add this to the VHS collection and the SNES collection. If you have suggestions for me to add to my SNES or VHS collections or NES collection, my wall looks pretty good for that, but I'm happy always to entertain your suggestions, and I do grab them every once in a while. But these deals, I couldn't pass up on these. I did get some other horror movies, which I'm sure I'm going to be doing a full horror movie special, but I'm going to try is the operative word, to wait until closer to Halloween for that stuff, because I have a lot of really great ones now. But no promises. I might just do one soon. But again, suggestions for the show, for ideas, for guests, for movies, for video games, books, TV that you want me to dive into, nonsense conspiracy theories you'd like me to really get in depth on, always feel free to email me, defeatedbydeliciousfruitpies@gmail.com. Throw some comments. Please push the like button. The like button and comments are actually how this channel grows. So the way that this works is when you press like, it's a thumbs up on the page, on the video while you're watching it. Then you comment in the video. So when you're commenting or you're replying to other people's comments, it shows like, ooh, there's interaction here. So while I'm getting thousands of views for the videos that we're doing, it's still not getting us on trending, and it's not getting us on the top page of people suggested. Because if it was, I mean, we'd be growing exponentially. It'd be huge. So just, keep that in mind. If you like it and you send it to people, sharing it also matters. So if you actually click the share button and you send that link on to other people, that also helps with interaction with the statistics. I don't know, Google does all these things. But comment in the comment section if you're watching this after the fact. That'll be the public one. This is the live stream one. I will make this video private, and then I will download it, I will edit it, and then I will upload it, hopefully all tonight. No promises on that. If I can, I'll do it tomorrow. And as always, I will upload the video or the episode on audio on iTunes, and feel free to subscribe on iTunes or on Libsyn. If you do that, then every time a new episode comes up, you will get it automatically, and then you can listen to my sweet, sweet, soothing voice talk about American heroes being degenerates and other things that you'll really be happy to hear on your way to work or on your way home from work. I'm just really happy to do that public service for you all. So with that, or if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer that. Otherwise, we're going to call it for this week. I'm really excited for next week. We're going to be talking about some really straightforward media stuffs. But I had to get this off my chest. This has been bothering me all weekend, honestly. It's just driving me nuts. And, and I'm sure Helen Keller doesn't care. She didn't hear any of this because she's dead. Where was your head, jerk? All right, thanks, everybody. Really happy to have everybody here, and we'll see you guys next time. Defeated.